The evening sun was setting over the quiet suburbs of Maryland, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple. A black SUV cruised smoothly down the tree-lined streets. Its driver, a distinguished FBI agent with salt and pepper hair, had just wrapped up one of the biggest cases of his career. After months of tracking down cybercriminals who'd been threatening major financial institutions, he could finally look forward to a peaceful weekend with his family. The neighborhood was peaceful, with kids riding their bikes home before dinner and couples walking their dogs along the sidewalks. The FBI agent smiled, thinking about his own family waiting at home. His daughter had a dance recital coming up, and his son had just made the honor roll. These small moments of pride kept him going through the toughest cases. Inside his car, the gentle hum of the radio played softly in the background as he mentally planned the weekend ahead. Maybe they'd have that backyard barbecue they'd been talking about, or finally get around to fixing up the old treehouse. His wife had been teasing him about his promises to renovate it for months now. As he drove, he was extra careful to follow every traffic rule to the letter. It was a habit deeply ingrained from his 15 years of service. Complete stops at every sign, perfect signaling before each turn, and always exactly at the speed limit. His colleagues often joked about how he was the most by-the-book driver they'd ever met, but he took pride in setting a good example. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on, creating a warm glow along the residential streets. He checked his watch. 6:45 p.m. If traffic stayed light, he'd be home in time for dinner. His wife had mentioned something about trying a new recipe she'd found online, and the thought of a home-cooked meal made him realize just how hungry he was. As he turned onto Cedar Avenue, he noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it, just another law enforcement officer doing their rounds. But then he noticed something odd. The cruiser had been following him for the last 3 turns. He mentally retraced his driving. No violations, no mistakes, nothing that would warrant attention. The FBI agent adjusted his mirror slightly, getting a better view of the patrol car behind him. Years of training and experience had taught him to be observant of details like this. Something didn't feel right about this situation, but he remained calm and collected. Little did he know, this routine drive home was about to become anything but ordinary. He could feel the tension building in his shoulders as the patrol car continued to follow him. As an FBI agent, he'd been in countless high-pressure situations, but there was something particularly unsettling about being followed without cause. He knew what was likely coming next, and sadly, he'd been in this situation before, just never while carrying his FBI credentials. The sun had nearly disappeared now, and the streets were getting darker. In his mind, he was already running through protocols and procedures, preparing himself for what might happen next. Years of experience had taught him how to handle difficult situations with grace and professionalism, and he was about to put all of that training to use. Just as he predicted, the flash of red and blue lights illuminated his rearview mirror. The FBI agent took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would likely become a powerful lesson about prejudice and power, one that would have lasting implications for everyone involved. The police cruiser's lights painted the quiet suburban street in alternating flashes of red and blue. The FBI agent carefully pulled his black SUV to the curb, positioning it perfectly parallel to ensure there could be no criticism of his parking. His hands moved deliberately to the steering wheel, placing them at the textbook 10 and 2 o'clock positions where they would be clearly visible. Through his side mirror, he watched the police officer emerge from the patrol car. Something about the officer's body language set off warning bells in the agent's mind. The stiff posture, the hand hovering near the holster, the aggressive stride. After 15 years in law enforcement, he could read these signs like a book. This wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. The agent took slow, steady breaths, keeping his expression neutral. He'd been on both sides of traffic stops countless times throughout his career, but this felt different. The weight of his FBI badge in his pocket felt heavier than usual, but he decided to wait before revealing his identity. Sometimes these moments could become valuable learning experiences. The tap on his window was harder than necessary, almost angry. The agent pressed the button to lower his window smoothly, letting the cool evening air flow into the car. The officer's flashlight beam swept across the interior of the SUV before settling directly on the agent's face, the light unnecessarily bright and intentionally disorienting. "License and registration," the officer demanded, skipping any pretense of a greeting. His voice carried an edge of assumed authority, the kind that often masked something else: prejudice, fear, or both. The agent noted how the officer's free hand still hadn't left the vicinity of his weapon, despite seeing a well-dressed man in an expensive SUV who was completely compliant. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" The agent asked calmly, his voice steady and professional. He knew there had been no traffic violations. He was meticulous about his driving, especially in residential areas. The response was predictable but still disappointing. "I don't have to explain myself to you," the officer snapped, his flashlight beam unwavering. "Documents. Now." The agent could hear the slight tremor in the officer's voice, a mix of adrenaline and something else. Perhaps the discomfort of knowing this stop had no real justification. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Nearby, a couple walking their dog had stopped to watch the scene unfold. The agent saw them in his mirror, the woman already holding up her phone, likely recording. These situations had become all too familiar in recent years, but this one was about to take an unexpected turn. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now," the agent announced clearly, his movements slow and deliberate. He knew this moment could go wrong in 100 different ways, had seen it happen too many times in his line of work. The officer's grip tightened visibly on his flashlight, his other hand still hovering near his weapon. As the agent carefully extracted his wallet, he could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been pulled over for no good reason, every citizen who'd felt the sting of prejudice wrapped in the cloak of authority. His FBI credentials would change everything in a few seconds, but the real question was, would it change anything in the long run? The night air carried the distant sound of crickets, a peaceful backdrop to this tense scene. A car drove past slowly, its passengers rubbernecking at the tableau of power and prejudice playing out on their quiet suburban street. The agent held his wallet, ready to present his identification, knowing that the next few moments would likely become a story told in police briefing rooms and FBI training sessions for years to come. With measured movements, the FBI agent opened his wallet, watching how the officer tensed at even this simple action. The streetlights cast long shadows across the scene, while more neighbors had gathered on their porches, drawn by the flashing police lights and the growing tension in the air. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his flashlight beam unwavering. His voice carried an edge of nervousness now, perhaps realizing that more and more witnesses were gathering. A teenager across the street had joined the couple with their dog, all recording with their phones. The agent's fingers moved carefully through his wallet, noting how each small movement seemed to make the officer more agitated. Years of experience had taught him to stay calm in situations like this, but he couldn't help feeling a deep sadness at how familiar this scene was, not just to him, but to countless others who didn't have an FBI badge to fall back on. "Sir, I'm going to pull out my identification now," the agent announced clearly, his voice steady and professional. He could see sweat beginning to form on the officer's forehead, despite the cool evening air. The hand near the holster hadn't moved, and the flashlight beam shook slightly. "Just the driver's license," the officer demanded, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. Nothing else. But it was too late. The agent had already withdrawn both his driver's license and his FBI credentials, holding them up together in the beam of the flashlight. The change in the officer's demeanor was instant and dramatic. The flashlight beam wavered, then dropped entirely. The hand near the holster fell limply to his side. In the sudden darkness, the red and blue lights seemed to flash even more intensely, highlighting the officer's rapidly paling face. I didn't," the officer stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew. The FBI agent maintained his professional composure, even as he noticed more cars slowing down to observe the scene. Some neighbors had edged closer, their phones still recording every moment of this unexpected turn of events. "Officer," the agent spoke calmly, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "I believe we need to have a conversation about proper procedure during traffic stops." He kept his tone measured, educational rather than confrontational. This wasn't about humiliation, it was about change. The gathered crowd had grown larger now, with whispers and murmurs floating through the night air. The officer shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of his audience. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. "I'm going to step out of the vehicle now," the agent announced, maintaining his clear, professional tone. "Then you and I are going to have a discussion about probable cause and constitutional rights." He moved slowly, deliberately, knowing that every eye in the vicinity was focused on this interaction. As he emerged from his SUV, the agent stood tall but non-threatening. His suit jacket opened slightly, revealing the holstered service weapon he was authorized to carry. The officer took an instinctive step back, looking very much like someone who had just realized they'd made a terrible mistake. "What's your badge number, officer?" the agent asked, his voice firm but not unkind. He could have been angry, could have let this situation escalate, but he had a different approach in mind. This moment had the potential to be something more than just another confrontation. It could be a teaching opportunity, a chance for real change. The FBI credentials seemed to glow under the street lights, the golden badge catching and reflecting the red and blue flashes from the police cruiser. The officer stared at it as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing, his mouth slightly open, all his previous authority draining away like water through a sieve. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," the agent stated clearly, his voice carrying to the growing crowd of onlookers. He held the credentials steady, letting the reality of the situation sink in. "Special agent in charge of the Cybersecurity Division." The words hung in the air like heavy rain clouds, and the officer's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: disbelief, recognition, and finally, something close to panic. "Sir, I didn't realize," the officer stuttered, his earlier aggression completely evaporated. His hand, which had been so quick to hover near his weapon earlier, now fidgeted with his uniform collar. Sweat was visible on his forehead despite the cool evening air, and his breathing had become noticeably uneven. The agent maintained his professional demeanor, though inside he felt a mix of emotions: disappointment at the obvious prejudice that had led to this stop, hope that this could become a learning moment, and a deep understanding of how differently this situation might have played out if he hadn't been a federal agent. A car drove by slowly, its passengers clearly filming the scene on their phones. The officer noticed this too, and his discomfort seemed to increase tenfold. The tables had turned so completely that it was almost painful to watch, but the agent knew this moment needed to happen. "Would you like to explain to me why you pulled me over?" the agent asked, his tone now carrying the full weight of his federal authority. The question hung in the air like a suspended judgment. The officer shifted from foot to foot, unable to meet the agent's steady gaze. "I thought I saw," the officer began, then stopped, realizing how hollow any excuse would sound. The truth was written all over his face. There had been no valid reason for the stop, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions in the most unexpected way possible. The crowd had grown larger, with neighbors emerging from their homes drawn by the unusual scene. The officer's discomfort was visible as he became increasingly aware of the numerous phone cameras recording every moment. His earlier confidence had been replaced by a nervous energy that made him look much younger and less sure of himself. "Let me guess," the agent continued, his voice level but carrying an edge of authority that made everyone listen closely. "You saw a black man in an expensive car in a nice neighborhood, and you made some assumptions." The words weren't angry, just matter-of-fact, which somehow made them even more powerful. The officer's face flushed red, visible even in the mix of streetlights and police lights. He opened his mouth to respond, closed it, then opened it again, but no words came out. The silence spoke volumes, and the watching crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. "Here's what's going to happen next," the agent said, maintaining his professional composure. "You're going to provide me with your badge number, your supervisor's name, and contact information." He paused, letting each requirement sink in. "And then you and I are going to have a very important conversation about law enforcement procedures and constitutional rights." The night air felt charged with electricity, the moment heavy with significance. What had started as a biased traffic stop had transformed into something else entirely, a powerful lesson about assumptions, authority, and accountability. The officer's face showed that he understood exactly how badly he had misjudged the situation, and more importantly, how serious the consequences of his actions could be. The suburban streak had become an impromptu stage, with the FBI agent and the police officer as its main actors. The officer fumbled with his notepad, his hands shaking slightly as he wrote down his badge number and supervisor's information. The red and blue lights continued their silent dance across the faces of the gathered onlookers, who remained transfixed by the scene unfolding before them. "Your supervisor will be receiving a call first thing tomorrow morning," the agent said, his voice calm but firm as he accepted the trembling notepad. He couldn't help but notice how the officer's demeanor had completely transformed, from aggressive authority to nervous submission in the span of a few minutes. It was a stark reminder of how power dynamics could shift in an instant. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the murmurs of the watching crowd. Some were still recording on their phones, while others whispered among themselves, sharing their own stories of similar encounters. The agent was acutely aware that this moment was bigger than just this one traffic stop. It was a window into a larger problem that needed addressing. "I want you to look around," the agent said, gesturing to the gathering of neighbors. "Every person here witnessed how this stop began and how you conducted yourself." The officer's eyes darted nervously from face to face in the crowd, the reality of his actions sinking in deeper with each passing moment. A young boy on a bicycle had stopped at the edge of the crowd, watching with wide eyes. The agent noticed him and felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake, it was about setting an example for the next generation. The boy's presence reminded him of his own children at home, waiting for their father to return from work. "I could file a formal complaint right now," the agent continued, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "I could make sure this incident follows you for the rest of your career." The officer's face paled even further, but the agent wasn't finished. "However, I believe in turning mistakes into learning opportunities." More cars had slowed down to observe the scene, their headlights adding to the theatrical lighting of the moment. Some drivers humped in support, having pieced together what was happening from the body language of those involved. The officer flinched at each honk, his discomfort visible to everyone watching. "Tomorrow, I'll be speaking with your department about implementing additional training," the agent explained, maintaining his professional tone. "I want you to be part of that conversation." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This isn't about punishment, it's about growth and change." The crowd had grown quieter, hanging on every word. Even the couple with the dog, who had witnessed the entire encounter from the beginning, had moved closer to hear the agent's words. Their phone was still recording, but their faces showed appreciation for how the situation was being handled. "Your actions tonight reflect not just on you, but on every person who wears a badge," the agent continued, his words measured and clear. "We have a responsibility to protect and serve everyone equally, without bias or prejudice." He gestured to his FBI credentials, still visible in his hand. "This badge means something, and so does yours." The night air had grown cooler, but nobody in the crowd seemed eager to leave. They were witnessing something important, not just a confrontation, but a moment of potential transformation. The officer stood straighter, though his face still showed the shame of his early actions. "I expect to see you at tomorrow's meeting," the agent concluded, his tone suggesting this was not a request. "We'll discuss proper procedure, constitutional rights, and the importance of unbiased policing." He placed special emphasis on the last part, knowing that these words would likely be shared widely through the videos being recorded. The next morning arrived with a sense of purpose. The FBI agent walked into the local police department precisely at 9 a.m., his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor of the precinct. The front desk officer straightened immediately upon seeing his credentials, quickly making calls to announce his arrival. Within minutes, the police chief emerged from his office, his face a mixture of concern and professional courtesy. The videos from the previous night had already made their way to his desk, spreading through social media like wildfire. Some clips had gathered thousands of views, with comments pouring in from across the country. "We take these matters very seriously," the police chief said as they settled into the conference room. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, creating strips of light across the large table. The officer from last night sat at one end, looking like he hadn't slept much, his usual confidence replaced by quiet reflection. The agent placed his briefcase on the table, retrieving several folders. "I'm not here to point fingers," he began, his voice carrying the same measured tone from the previous night. I'm here to help implement changes that will prevent similar incidents in the future. The room fell silent, everyone present understanding the gravity of the situation. As the meeting progressed, more officers filed in, drawn by word of mouth about what was happening. The agent used the opportunity to share real experiences, statistics, and examples of how unconscious bias could affect law enforcement decisions. The officer from last night spoke too, surprising everyone with his honesty about what he'd learned. I never thought of myself as biased, the officer admitted, his voice slightly shaky but determined. But watching those videos of myself last night, he paused, gathering his thoughts. I didn't recognize the person I saw. That's not who I want to be as an officer. The agent nodded encouragingly, pulling up a presentation on the room's projector. Charts and graphs appeared, showing traffic stop statistics that painted a clear picture of systemic issues. But instead of using these numbers to condemn, he used them to educate. Every interaction we have with the public shapes their trust in law enforcement, the agent explained, clicking through slides that showed both positive and negative examples. We have the power to either build that trust or break it down, one encounter at a time. The police chief leaned forward, taking detailed notes. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a catalyst for departmental change. Plans were made for new training programs, regular reviews of traffic stop data, and community outreach initiatives. By midday, the conference room had transformed into a workshop space, with officers actively participating in role-playing scenarios and discussing better approaches to traffic stops. The officer from last night, particularly engaged in these exercises, seeming eager to learn and improve. This is just the beginning, the agent said, watching the officers work through various scenarios. Real change takes time and commitment. He pulled out his card, handing it to the police chief. I'm offering my department's resources to help implement these changes properly. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from tense to hopeful. Even the most skeptical officers had begun to see the value in what was being discussed. The morning sun had given way to afternoon light, but nobody seemed eager to leave. They were all invested in this moment of transformation. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the changes in the police department were remarkable. The FBI agent stood at the podium in the police academy's main lecture hall, looking out at a sea of eager faces, both veteran officers and new recruits, all there to learn from his experience. The officer from that night sat in the front row, but he wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. He had become an active participant in the department's new training program, sharing his story with every incoming class of recruits. His honesty about his mistakes and what he'd learned from them had earned him respect among his peers. Real change happens one decision at a time, the agent began, clicking to the first slide of his presentation. The screen showed dashcam footage from that night, but now it was being used as a powerful teaching tool. What you're about to see is more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. It's an opportunity to learn and grow. The lecture hall was packed, with officers from neighboring districts attending as well. Word had spread about the positive changes happening in this department, and others wanted to learn from their experience. The agent noticed several community leaders in attendance too, a sign of the growing partnership between law enforcement and the public. Since implementing our new training programs, the agent continued, pulling up a fresh set of statistics. This department has seen a 60% reduction in complaint filings. The numbers told a story of progress, improved community relations, more positive interactions, and better outcomes during traffic stops. The officer who had been involved in the incident stood up to share his perspective. His voice was steady now, confident in a different way than before. I thought I knew everything about being a good cop, he admitted to the crowd. But that night taught me that we never stop learning, never stop growing. Videos played on the screen showing the new training exercises in action, officers practicing de-escalation techniques, learning about cultural awareness, and engaging in community outreach programs. The agent smiled, remembering how these changes had started from one difficult moment. A hand raised in the audience. It was one of the new recruits. How do we make sure we're making the right decisions in the heat of the moment? She asked. The agent nodded, appreciating the thoughtful question. This was exactly the kind of self-awareness they wanted to encourage. It starts with acknowledging our own biases, the agent explained, sharing examples from his own career. We all have them. The key is recognizing them and not letting them control our actions. The room was silent, everyone taking notes, truly engaged in the discussion. The presentation shifted to show community feedback. Local residents sharing positive experiences with officers, children feeling comfortable approaching police, and statistics showing improved trust between law enforcement and minorities. These weren't just numbers on a screen, they represented real changes in people's lives. This isn't just about avoiding mistakes, the agent emphasized, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. It's about building trust, one interaction at a time. He clicked to the next slide, showing photos from recent community events, where officers and residents worked together on local projects. As the session wrapped up, the officer from that night approached the podium. He looked different now, not just in his demeanor, but in his understanding of his role as a police officer. "That night could have ended my career," he said to the agent. "Instead, it made me a better officer." The agent watched as officers lingered after the presentation, discussing what they'd learned, sharing their own experiences, and committing to doing better. This was the real victory, not just changing one department, but starting a ripple effect that could transform law enforcement across the country.